She specialises in research development relevant to Middle Eastern affairs, culture, history and sectarian violence. She is looking to establish herself in disciplines to international development, social anthropology and Middle Eastern studies. In a few months she will graduate from Kingston University, inshallah, to attain her BA Honours qualification in politics and international relations. She has been privileged enough in the past to have worked extensively alongside non-governmental organisations, local grassroots organisations, charities and universities. The most recent example would be the time she spent teaching at a university in the West Bank, where she also partook in a cultural youth exchange programme. What interests her most, however, is her desire to expand her relationships and efforts both regionally and internationally, also hoping that one day, like most of the Iraqi diaspora, she can return back to Iraq. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm reception to Nazli Tarzi.
Assalamu alaikum. I've been invited here to discuss the minority situation at present in Iraq. But in order for us to understand the role that minorities play, we do have to refer back to some of the fateful decisions that took place under the Coalition Provisional Authority in 2003. This is not because 2003 is the only source and the main cause of conflict in Iraq today, the sectarian strife that we see running riot, but it's because 2003 acted as a catalyst to the sporadic sprees of violence that reached an unprecedented height in 2006. So I guess it might interest you for me to inform you what it is that makes me want to know more about Iraq. In 2006, there was a civil war that took place, and we've heard that between 1,600,000 people and 3,200,000 people died. So I want to understand a little bit more about why a fellow Iraqi would kill another fellow Iraqi. So I'd like to elaborate a bit on that first to begin with. So in 2003, as the troops marched into Iraq, you have a new climate. You have a new climate of fear, you have a new climate of apprehension, you have a new climate of opportunities, suppressed opportunities, and you have a battle for political status. Okay, so I'll talk a little about the regime that involves a two-stage process. The first stage was the military occupation, where the US forces decided and believed it would be necessary to create an indeterminate space when neither US law or Iraqi law can be upheld. So what do you have? You have a situation where there is a power vacuum. So everything is up for grabs. The Iraqi state is up for grabs. So people find themselves asking the question, so what does the new Iraq hold for me? And sadly, 10 years on, this is a question that we continue to ask ourselves, whether we are Iraqis living inside of Iraq itself or living outside. The second phase of the process involved not regime change, but regime replacement. Okay? So you have the governing Iraqi council that was elected, that was not elected, it was appointed on a sectarian basis. And more importantly, I'd like to remind us that 9 of those politicians, if you can call them politicians, depending on your own perspective, were in exile previous to that. So they were unknown to the Iraqi people. So I find it quite distressing that these people on the outside come in to represent the Iraqi population when in reality that's not the case. So you have this new Iraqi governing council who were appointed by the Coalition Provisional Authority, and what they're doing is protecting their own interests. They're not protecting, per se, the interests of the Iraqi people as a whole, but when you have an interim government that is supposed to represent Iraqi interests that's elected on a sectarian basis, what does that create? Well, that creates the grounds for sectarian, or a potential for sectarian violence, as we saw. So what happens is you have a new climate where new actors come in and they seek to mobilize certain groups of Iraqis playing on differences so they can secure a base for themselves. And what happens is vulnerable Iraqis, if they have their interests, if they have their necessary needs provided for them, will begin to give their support over to these in the Shia suburbs in Baghdad. What he didn't do, however, was provide these services to all Iraqis. He provided these services to a select, distinctive group to Iraqis. So what happens is the balance of power in Iraq from 2003 shifted in favour of groups that were previously marginalised. And when I talk about those groups, I refer to the Kurdish Iraqis and the Shia Iraqis. I do hate to label Iraqis as such, and I agree with Sabah's point earlier. I think it only continues and perpetuates the divisive relationships that exist. But it's in order for us to put into perspective the position that minorities have in Iraq today. Because the minorities as they stand are the Sunni Arabs, the Turkmen who live alongside the Kurds in the north, and the Assyrian Christians. The Assyrian Christians, for example, who made up 1.5 million Iraqis before 2003, have been reduced to a mere 500,000. Why? Because groups who feel more and more excluded are developing a desire to leave their country. Because they are sick and tired and distressed of suffering. So another group of marginalised people that I'd like to talk a little bit about are the internally displaced Iraqis who live primarily within Baghdad. These are living in the most vulnerable position out of any of the other groups that I've briefly touched upon so far. But what's happening at the moment is you have incumbent governmental institutions who are supposedly making slow steps towards democratic transition, a transparent process, it may be, that is supposed to occur at both the societal level and the governmental level. However, so long as Iraqi interests remain at the bottom of the political agenda, then we're not really going to see any progress forward. And what happens is, when material interests are added into the mix, so when people kind of are able to access more land, more oil, more however it may be, that creates even more tensions. So you have one group believing it has more rights than another group, or there are some groups whose rights are more equal than other groups. And this just sounds totally futile and quite irrational to me. But again, this is why I began my talk with 2003, because I believe that the trigger, the historical trigger that enabled this to happen was the American invasion, where a power vacuum was created and divide and rule tactics were used no different than the way that they were used in Saddam Hussein's time. What was different this time was the way in which groups mobilized and how they weren't able to do this in the past. So you have a sense of victimization, you have a new politics of identity, you have a politicization of identities, and that should not be the case, because this is when the divisions will become intractable. And this is why we have found, this is why the Iraqi state has gotten to the state that it's in. So you have new patterns of violence, new patterns of persecution, new patterns of grievances emerge. And so long as groups hold on really tightly to their historical imagination, where they associate their historical experiences with their new obligation of how they should act politically in society, we are not going to move forward. So while there might be an Iraqi spring happening as we see it unfold before our very eyes, we do need the support of all of the politicians in Iraq. So I do have to say that while I am optimistic, I am slightly pessimistic in what Sabah said earlier about, well, he thinks that the Iraqi people are ready. The point that we're at now constitutes the point where they are ready to join hands and overthrow Maliki's dictatorship. Well, we all know that the situation is a little bit more complex than that, but how is it that we're going to move towards coexistence and intracommunal peace if we can't set aside our differences or our past? What's mine is mine, but what's yours is also mine because of the way I suffered in the past. Well, I don't see this as right. So I think that what we ought to do here in the United Kingdom is lobby as much as we can, but also to try and always refer back to history, because what is really, really dangerous and frightening and saddening, and it's a sobering reality, but it's the fact that polarization within the second generation of Iraqis or Arabs, whoever they may be, is even deeper than it is in Iraq, because these individuals never had to coexist. They never had to live side by side with one another. So all they see, the Iraqis who hear these different stories from their parents, is carry on the grievance, carry on that historical memory that some people even trace back to the 6th Islamic century, which is totally untrue and quite embarrassing, and I'm quite ashamed to kind of associate myself with Iraqis who happen to do that themselves. But what happens is, okay, so we put our differences aside, we still need redistribution of economic resources, because one of the most challenging issues that Iraqis have come face with throughout century is, well, you have this and you don't have this. This group is excluded, this group is included while this group is excluded. So the Americans were able to borrow age-old Ba'athist policies and dress them up as policies of liberation, policies of democracy, when we haven't seen these. And as it stands, Iraq is the 8th most corrupt country in the world. So I believe that there are small steps that need to be taken, but also there needs to be kind of a universal sense of understanding and appreciation and consideration to other people's past. Otherwise, we will see the Kurdish government take over the region completely, attempt to incorporate Kirkuk, which a lot of Turkmen, a lot of Christians, a lot of Sunni Arabs during the Arabization policies that the Ba'ath introduced in the 70s had helped to deliver. So, in addition to all the other problems we face a demographic issue in the country. But this won't be solved if the corruption isn't solved in the moment, because at the moment the money is being distributed along sectarian lines. So while I believe that sectarianism is a myth, it has actually become a reality due to this historical sense of memory, this sense of victimization, and this battle. Well, my physical survival depends on the way I mobilize with my group and how I situate myself with my group. And I don't think that's true. So, what is clear to me is you can't really divorce your social, cultural, and political rights from your economic, judicial rights. The two go hand in hand. And the government needs to step its game up, even though I do believe that pressure is being mounted upon it. However, there are huge discrepancies still taking place. So for instance, we were told in 2010 that there are 2.6 million internally displaced Iraqis living within Baghdad, mainly. But the government a year later said, well, that number's reduced to 1.3 million. Okay, if that's the case, I think it's necessary to ask, where has the remainder of those IDPs gone? The previous figures, statistical figures have shown. So, the future, while it looks bleak, can be changed, can be shaped by us, by our connection, by building relationships with people in Iraq. But I guess we need to start talking. So what happens is a lot of Iraqi events and things related to such matters take place in Iraq. There is still polarity amongst these different groups. Well, I mean, not that it had been the duty of previous leaders, but there was a sense of cohesion before in the idea that we are Iraqis and we are working towards the nation. So my call today is for us to rejuvenate this idea